Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. A tranquil maritime city was waking up. People bustled through their morning routines, getting kids off to school, adults out the door. Shopkeepers unhooked shutters, swept stoops, and greeted the first customers of the day. Factories hummed as fresh day shift workers replaced the weary night crews. Trains chugged, boats churned, automobiles revved, and streetcars lurched toward downtown. It was a typical early December day, frosty but calm. One of those mornings where you can feel the winter's chill arriving and begin anticipating the snow that will soon blanket the landscape. Everyone was bundled up for the season, though the biting wind that usually howled off the harbour was mercifully quiet. Despite the constant hustle of a city absorbed in wartime production, the morning felt unusually calm and serene. Until everything changed. In an instant, Halifax was ripped apart by a massive blast that sent shockwaves across Canada and around the globe. In today's episode, we'll explore the lead-up to the greatest disaster in Canadian history, the Halifax explosion of 1917. A series of ill-timed mistakes and coincidences conspired to set the stage for a cataclysmic event no one could have predicted. Before the devastating blast, most people were simply living out their Thursday, following ordinary routines in extraordinary times. The split-second decisions that followed, some deliberate, others without explanation, would determine who lived and who died. We'll trace the movements of everyday Haligonians as the disaster drew near. Then, in our next episode, we'll turn to the aftermath, the devastation, the city's long recovery, and of course, the eerie ghost stories that continue to haunt Halifax to this day. But before we get to that, we're at that scary part of the summer where the days seem to be flying by too fast. But at the same time, that can only mean one thing: spooky season draws near. If you're trying to make the most of your summer while the warm nights last, join us for a ghost tour or paranormal adventure in Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto, Ontario. My 3 hidden gems for this summer are Ghosts of the Village at Black Creek in Toronto, Tales from the Mausoleum at Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa, and the Ghosts of Queen's University in Kingston. Each offers a unique setting, fascinating stories, and more than a few chills. And a little secret to share, most of our Halloween season tickets are already on sale, and the rest will be very soon. For tickets and more eerie info, please visit hauntedwalk.com, and be sure to use the promo code HauntedTalks at checkout to save 15% on most tickets. We also have a few surprises and big announcements up our sleeve, so this is the perfect time to keep an eye on the Haunted Walk on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk. To appreciate this story, we need to understand a little about Halifax. On Nova Scotia's southeast shore, along the vast North Atlantic, Halifax is the provincial capital and the largest city in the Maritimes. Together with neighboring Dartmouth and Bedford, it serves as a regional hub of business and trade and home to hundreds of thousands of people. Today, it's the gateway to Canada's eastern shores, a city known for its natural beauty, relatively mild climate, thriving art scene, and maritime charm. Halifax is both a popular tourist destination and a beloved place to call home. Hundreds of years ago, the site of Halifax held a very different importance. The Mi'kmaq had lived in this region of Nova Scotia since time immemorial, long before Europeans arrived. Their thriving communities relied on the sea's abundance and maintained trade networks stretching along the Atlantic coast and far inland. When Europeans arrived in the 1700s, they quickly recognized the site's strategic value. Sloping cliffs framed a narrow inlet that opened into a wide basin. Even in the northern climate, the deep waters rarely froze, creating an ideal harbor, both accessible and well protected. It didn't take long for Halifax Harbour to grow into one of Britain's most important strategic ports. The entire settlement was built to support the harbour economy and to ensure British control over the waterway. Yet the city's natural geography and its defensive works were never truly tested. Halifax was never directly attacked, likely because it was considered almost impossible to overtake. No one could have imagined that a war raging on the far side of the world, one that never reached Canada's borders, would bring this formidable harbour to the edge of destruction. By the early 20th century, Halifax's economy was unstable. Rail transportation was steadily replacing short-haul shipping. New canals and channels were drawing business away, forcing transportation companies to relocate. Manufacturing was leaving too, shifting to cheaper markets in central Canada. Investments in the harbour were inconsistent, and the city's future looked uncertain. That all changed with the outbreak of the First World War. Canada was immediately drawn in when Britain declared war on the Axis powers in August 1914. The Dominion was expected to provide troops and supplies, but its overseas allies had another advantage. With its position across the Atlantic, far from the front lines, Canada could serve as a home base for building and transporting war goods. No one knew it then, but the seeds of the Halifax explosion had been planted. The world's first total war demanded enormous resources. Ammunition, ships, and troops had to be collected and moved without pause to meet a relentless demand. It was a war of attrition, and victory would go to the side that kept its supply lines intact the longest. Halifax became a natural hub for this supply chain, soon emerging as the most vital harbor for ships crossing the Atlantic. With inland rail connections and a basin that never froze, it was essential to the Allied war effort. That importance made its near destruction all the more dramatic. In the final months of 1917, Halifax was in full production. The harbor bustled, factories ran around the clock, and the city's population kept growing. Both permanent residents and newcomers were contributing to the war effort. Everything seemed to be booming, and optimism was rising. The United States had recently entered the war, and the tide was beginning to turn in favor of the Allies. Everyone was pushing hard, determined to do their part to help bring the conflict to an end. At 7:30 a.m. on December 6, 1917, Halifax was settling into its daily routines, including harbour pilot Francis Mackey, who held a critical role in the war effort. Harbour pilots guided the many ships entering and leaving each day. In Halifax, their work usually began before a vessel entered the Narrows, an especially nail-biting stretch where the open waters of the Atlantic funneled into a narrow passage leading to the Bedford Basin. The very geography that made Halifax so easy to defend also made ship captains nervous, as the risky turns demanded a skilled hand. Pilots joined captains at the helm to advise or take control during this perilous stage. It was a prestigious job, reserved for only the best mariners. Mackey was among the elite, and that morning his assignment came through. He would be piloting the French munition ship, the SS Mont Blanc. Mackey had piloted countless ships before, including massive transports laden with goods bound for the European front. But this voyage was different. The Mont Blanc carried deadly cargo, highly explosive munitions of every kind. In New York City, nervous loaders had packed the hold with painstaking care, each aware that a single jolt might trigger disaster. The crew also knew the danger. With such volatile materials below deck, even an unexpected wave could send the ship, and everyone aboard, sky high. The nervous energy from the Mont Blanc seemed to hang over the harbor, thick in the air, like a dark cloud of war. Pilot Mackey knew some basic details about the munitions. Transporting explosives was nothing new. He even attempted to order special protection for the ship before boarding that fateful morning. But he was likely unaware of just how delicate the aging Mont Blanc really was. Still, he approached his job with seriousness and caution, knowing that even the smallest decision carried weight in the war effort. Reflecting months later, many people wished Mackey was better briefed about that precious cargo. He could have likely avoided the disaster that was about to unfold. Back on land, it was now 8 a.m., and for most Haligonians, it was just an ordinary day. In the countless family homes in and around the harbor, people were getting ready to begin their daily duties, most of which contributed to the war effort in some way. Newspapers telling of the latest Allied victories and losses were opened and read. Stoves and hearths were lit. Most families, like the Chapmans, finished up their breakfast. Young Kay Chapman remembered the day unfolding just like any other in the close-knit neighborhood of Richmond. She was still a bit too young for school, but she loved seeing her siblings rush off every morning before she helped her mother around the house. Kay watched her brothers and sisters get ready, putting on their coats and winter wear before bounding out the door on that frosty December morning. They were running late, so the Chapman household was a little more frantic than usual. That small, inconsequential detail ended up saving lives. Halifax was a prospector's paradise, with jobs everywhere and a sense of purpose for all. On the morning of December 6th, crowds filled the ramshackle streets on their way to work, confident they were helping sustain the war effort. Vincent Coleman was already on duty at his post. He worked as a train dispatcher for Canadian government railways, responsible for directing trains in and out of Halifax. Since the main settlement of the city jutted out towards the ocean like a peninsula, the train traffic became congested without strict management. Both passenger and cargo trains were vital to keeping people and goods moving in support of the war. Dispatchers often acted like traffic cops, ensuring the trains were moving where they needed to be, and keeping them away from potential hazards. Coleman was trained for difficult situations and knew exactly what to do if disaster struck. Meanwhile, out on the water, the SS Mont Blanc was approaching the Narrows. Pilot Francis Mackey was on board the French munition ship, steadily guiding it into the channel. The vessel had been stationed outside the harbour barriers all night, and their crew was anxious to reach the safety of Halifax, away from the prowling German U-boats known to harass Atlantic crews. On the other side of the Narrows, in the Bedford Basin, a Norwegian ship, the SS Imo, was preparing to depart for New York to pick up supplies bound for Belgium. Their departure had already been delayed, and the crew dreaded further holdups in the busy channel. That morning, the Mont Blanc and the Imo were among the first vessels to start up their engines, heading in opposite directions within the shelter of Halifax Harbour. From either end of the Narrows, the ships drew closer. The outcome, set in motion by a handful of flawed decisions, would be catastrophic. The Imo entered the Narrows just after 8 a.m. and found another ship moving through its designated lane. An inconvenience, but not unusual in the busy harbour. To avoid it, the Imo veered left, hugging the Dartmouth side of the channel, anxious to get out of Halifax before the morning rush. The crew pushed the ship over the speed limit, a choice that reduced their ability to turn or reverse quickly. Firmly committed to the left side, the Imo now expected oncoming ships to pass starboard to starboard instead of the standard port to port. The Imo was breaking the rules, but under maritime protocol, the Mont Blanc was expected to yield to the exiting ship's wishes. It was just another chaotic day in the wartime harbour, and both crews were relieved to have experienced pilots at the helm. But it's worth remembering, the Mont Blanc was delicate, and sudden turns might upset the cargo. The ship was also very old and difficult to handle, even at low speeds. Besides, Mackey later testified that the Imo should have adjusted their course and returned to the proper side of the channel. There was no reason to continue breaking protocol. On board the Mont Blanc, Mackey clearly communicated his intent with the horn. They would pass on the port side. The Imo responded with their own horn. No, they would pass on the starboard side. In those days, maritime communication was almost exclusively delivered by horn blasts, which simply indicated yes or no, and didn't allow for any negotiation. Precious moments ticked by as the horns argued back and forth about who should be passing where. In the meantime, a third ship, a faster-moving tugboat, the Stella Maris, forced the Imo to steer further into the center of the Narrows, cutting off any chance of a last-minute deviation. It quickly became apparent to all aboard both ships that dramatic action was required to avoid a collision. Mackey wrenched the old, groaning Mont Blanc as hard as he could, desperate to avoid a catastrophic head-on with the Imo. The danger of shifting cargo was forgotten. The only choice was to try to dodge the collision, or it was all over. The effort was immense. Both ships strained, turning, braking, reversing, but it was too late. The Emo clipped the Mont Blanc at low speed. Metal shrieked, hulls shuddered in the cold morning air. Quickly thinking, Mackey had saved them from a direct hit and instant destruction, but the crew of the Mont Blanc knew what was packed deep in their hold. They held their breath, waiting for the blast that would send them into oblivion. Instead, silence. A heavy, eerie silence that settled over both ships. And then, nothing. No thunderous boom, no fireball, no shockwave, only the groan of twisted metal and the quiet slap of the waves against the bows. But for a heartbeat, it seemed as if disaster had been averted. But on the Mont Blanc, the truth was already visible. The collision had unsettled the cargo. Smoke curled upwards. Small tongues of flame licked the deck. The ship was a floating fuse. That fragile pause between impact and detonation was both a mercy and a curse. It spared the crew's lives, but it also allowed the burning ship to drift closer to shore, drawing crowds of people. With the fire already raging, the Mont Blanc crew was certain the ship was only moments away from exploding. No attempt was made to put it out, as any efforts were deemed futile. Pilot Mackey joined the rest of the crew, who evacuated in rowboats, trying to warn all passing ships as they went. But there was little they could do. Before the days of reliable radio, communication in the harbor was limited. They rowed as fast as they could in different directions, frantically waved their arms in the air, and hoped others would follow their lead. But the dramatic collision and fire had the opposite effect. Most people were running towards it, not away from it. A group of rescuers and firefighters quickly arrived on the scene, but most people were streaming towards the shore, where the Mont Blanc was drifting ever closer to. Haligonians had seen massive warships passing in and out of the Narrows for years, but now two had collided and caught fire. It was a dramatic event. People at the dock and on the shore were drawn to the fire, like a moth to a flame, unaware they would soon be burned. It was around 8:45 a.m. when the Mont Blanc and the Emo collided, and the timing could not have been worse. By then, the city was fully awake. Residents were already on the streets, hurrying to school and jobs. In Richmond, Halifax North End community, beside the Narrows, the sidewalks were packed with school children on their way to Thursday classes. Understandably, the dramatic fire, which was clearly visible from the downhill streets of Richmond, drew countless children away from their normal paths and towards the harbour. Other, more responsible students continued their journey, intent on arriving before the 9 a.m. bell rang. Both choices would prove deadly. News of the fire spread quickly, even without modern conveniences like the internet or social media. In Halifax, all it took was a look out the window. From homes and businesses across the city, people could see the smoke rising, the flames from the Mont Blanc growing brighter, visible for miles around the basin. Startled by the collision shudder, countless Haligonians pressed to their windows, staring in fascination. while some rushed outside for a better look. The fire department rolled out its prized engine, determined to stop the blaze before it spread to the neighborhoods along the Narrows. Hospitals went on alert, bracing for injured sailors. Halifax was prepared for accidents. But this was far beyond anything they could have expected. And as the crowds gathered to watch the burning ship, many had no idea that their decision to bear witness would be their last. Warnings about the Mont Blanc's cargo never reached the public. It was wartime, and secrecy was routine. Few could have guessed at the amount of deadly munitions that passed through the Halifax harbour almost every day. In the aftermath, questions lingered. Who knew what was on board, and who should have sounded the alarm? In truth, it likely wouldn't have mattered. Even if people had been warned, there was no outrunning what was about to occur. By now, workplaces were emptying as concern over the fire spread. Some fled, hurrying away from the waterfront, but others stayed rooted in place, transfixed by the burning ship. Crowds filled the streets, watching in awe. Halifax had come to a halt, waiting to see what would happen next. One of the first workplaces to clear out was the dispatch office at Richmond Station. Vincent Coleman and his colleagues were well within blast range. Unlike most of the crowds outside, they knew the Mont Blanc's deadly secret, told to them by a frantic sailor who burst in after the collision. Fearing the worst, the office was ordered evacuated. Before leaving, Coleman and his colleague Lovett tapped a Morse code warning to an incoming number 10 overnight train from St. John, New Brunswick. Then, like everyone else, they ran. But as Coleman fled, a thought stopped him cold. The number 10 was carrying more than 300 passengers. Would the message be received in time? Could they be saved? In that moment, Coleman cemented his place in Canadian history and turned back. He sprinted towards the dispatch station, within sight of the burning Mont Blanc. By 9 a.m., Pilot Mackey and other members of the Mont Blanc had reached shore. They landed at a Mi'kmaq settlement across the harbour from Halifax. Frantically, they tried to warn the residents, but there were no telegraph wires there, no phones, no way to carry their message beyond the reach of their voices. Still convinced the ship would explode at any moment, the crew fled deeper into the woods, desperate to save themselves. Kay Chapman had seen her siblings off to school, delighting in their frantic departure as they rushed out to make the 9 a.m. bell. Now, dressed in her favorite white dress and white stockings, she was ready to play Sunday school, one of her favorite pastimes where she pretended to lead imaginary children in lessons and song. But before she began playing, Kay suddenly had the urge to go outside for a quick look. Later, she couldn't recall what drew her to the door and away from the living room. She was unaware of the inferno in the harbour, and she rarely ever went outside to trail her siblings on their way to school. They had only just left and were steps away from the house when Kay made her life-saving decision. She turned her back on the living room and faced the exterior door. Meanwhile, Vincent Coleman was at his telegraph, calling and recalling, desperate to reach anyone he could. He urged the conductors to hold up every train. The harbour was about to explode. But what weighed heaviest on his mind was that number 10, the overnight train from St. John carrying 100 souls aboard. He had received no reply, no confirmation. At any moment, that train might pull straight into Richmond Station, within sight of the burning Mont Blanc. His nerves frayed, his fingers slipped on the key. Still, he clacked out message after message. They were rushed, riddled with errors, the words tumbling out in desperation. But the meaning was always the same. A final warning. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbour, making for Pier 6, and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. As Pilot Mackie crouched in the woods, bracing for the blast, as young Kay Chapman turned toward the door, her siblings only steps away, as Vincent Coleman tapped out his desperate warnings, one after another, the clock struck 9:04 a.m. and the world stopped. For a split second, silence held the city, sharp as an intake of breath. Survivors would later recall that fleeting calm, that instant before everything changed. The silence wouldn't last. In our next episode, we'll step in to that frozen minute at 9:04 a.m., the moment Halifax was torn apart at its seams. We'll explore the devastation that followed, the long road to recovery, and the ghost stories that still haunt the city more than a century later. Join us in 2 weeks for part 2 of the Halifax explosion. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. For tickets for any of our ghost tours or paranormal adventures at the end of the summer and throughout spooky season, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. We truly have something for everyone. Be sure to use your promo code HauntedTalks, all one word, at checkout to get 15% off most ghost tour tickets. We'd love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky, all at Haunted Walk. And be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. We always love reading your thoughts on what we're up to. As always, a special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode. Until we meet again for part 2, sweet dreams.